An angry mob threw the entire town council out of a third-story window, sparking 30 years of religious war. The morning of July 30th, 1419, dawned like any other in Prague's new town, but by sunset, the cobblestones would be stained with blood, and the Holy Roman Empire would be plunged into 3 decades of religious warfare. All because of what happened in those terrifying moments when gravity became an instrument of revolution. The tension had been building for years. Jan Hus, the beloved Czech theologian and reformer, had been burned at the stake in 1415, despite promises of safe conduct from the Holy Roman Emperor. His followers, known as Hussites, had watched their leader die screaming in the flames, while church officials celebrated. The wound festered in the Czech soul like an infected blade, and by 1419, Prague was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a young, fiery priest named Jan Želivský. Unlike other reform clergy who preached moderation, Želivský spoke in the language of revolution. He declared that the blood of Jan Hus cried out from the ground for vengeance, and that God himself demanded the cleansing of corruption from the church and state. His sermons at the Church of St. Mary of the Snows drew thousands of followers who hung on his every word like gospel truth. The immediate crisis began when Hussite prisoners were arrested and held in the new town hall. These were not criminals, but religious reformers, whose only crime was demanding that communion be offered in both bread and wine to common people, not just clergy. To the Hussites, this imprisonment was the final insult, proof that the Catholic authorities would never allow peaceful reform. On that fateful July morning, Želivský led a procession through Prague's streets, carrying the consecrated host. The procession was meant to be a peaceful demonstration of faith, but the priest's rhetoric had already transformed his followers into something more dangerous than mere protesters. They were crusaders convinced they were doing God's work. As the procession wound through the narrow medieval streets, it grew larger and angrier. Craftsmen abandoned their workshops to join. Merchants left their stalls. Even some minor nobility, secretly sympathetic to Huss's teachings, fell in behind the crowd. By the time they reached the new town hall, the procession had become a mob of nearly 3,000 people, their faces twisted with righteous fury. The new town hall stood as a symbol of Catholic authority, its Gothic towers looming over the square like a fortress of oppression. Inside, the town council was in session, fully aware of the approaching crowd, but confident in their stone walls and political authority. They had underestimated the depth of popular rage and the intoxicating power of religious fervor. Želivský mounted the steps of the town hall and demanded the immediate release of the Hussite prisoners. The response came not in words, but in the form of stones hurled from the upper windows. One struck a member of the crowd, and in that moment, peaceful protest transformed into revolutionary violence. The crowd surged forward like a human tsunami, battering down the heavy wooden doors with improvised rams and bare hands. The sounds of splintering wood and screaming voices echoed off the stone walls as Prague's citizens invaded their own seat of government. Town guards fled or were overwhelmed, their weapons useless against the sheer mass of humanity pouring through the entrance. The councillors barricaded themselves in the upper chamber, but medieval doors were no match for medieval fury. When the crowd finally broke through, they found the town's Catholic leadership huddled together like cornered animals. Judge of the town court, the burgomaster, and 13 councillors stood facing a mob that had moved beyond rational negotiation into the realm of blood justice. What happened next lasted only minutes, but would echo through centuries. One by one, the councillors were dragged to the tall Gothic windows overlooking the square. The judge went first, his screams cut short by the 30-foot fall onto the cobblestones below. The burgomaster followed, his body striking the stone fountain with a sickening crack. The 13 councillors came after, some begging for mercy, others maintaining defiant silence as they were hurled into space. But the fall was only the beginning of their ordeal. Those who survived the impact found themselves surrounded by the mob that had gathered in the square below. Men and women who had been their neighbors, their customers, their constituents, now became their executioners. Clubs, knives, and stones finished what gravity had begun. Bodies were beaten until they were no longer recognizable as human. The psychological impact of the defenestration went far beyond the immediate deaths. In medieval society, throwing someone from a window was not just murder, but a specific form of ultimate humiliation. It suggested the victims were literally trash to be discarded, unworthy even of a clean death by sword or axe. The symbolism was not lost on either side of the religious divide. News of the Prague defenestration spread across Europe with stunning speed. To Catholics, it was proof that the Hussite heretics were dangerous revolutionaries who threatened all legitimate authority. To reformers, it was a divine sign that God approved of violent resistance to corruption. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund declared war on Bohemia, beginning what would become known as the Hussite Wars. Jan Żelivski, the priest who had lit the fuse, was himself killed in 1422 when moderate Hussites turned against his radical faction. But the precedent had been set. The idea that religious conviction could justify throwing government officials from windows became embedded in Czech political culture. When Protestant Czech nobles defenestrated Catholic officials in 1618, they consciously invoked the memory of 1419, sparking the 30 Years' War that would devastate much of Europe. The cobblestones of Prague's new town hall square, stained with blood on that July afternoon in 1419, had become the launching pad for an era of religious warfare that would reshape the continent. 15 minutes of mob violence had generated 3 decades of international conflict, proving that sometimes the most momentous historical changes begin not with the clash of armies, but with the simple act of opening a window and letting gravity do the rest. Retry Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.